Students, welcome back once again to another in our series of video lectures on the Culture and Values textbook. And this is chapter 11, the 14th century, a time of transition. And as usual, I'm your instructor, Dr. Barry Graham. So as we look at this presentation, we are going to be looking first off of this map of Europe because we want to talk about the Black Death. The Black Death spread horrible disease in Europe and in the Near East between the years 1346 and 1353. It's also known as the Black Plague, the Great Plague, or simply the Plague. And it was one of the most devastating pandemics in human history, resulting in the deaths of an estimated 75 to 200 million people in Eurasia and peaking in Europe from about 1347 to 1351. It was said now we know to be caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, which results in several forms of plague. It's believed this was the cause. The plague created a series of religious, social, and economic upheavals, which had profound effects on the course of European history. The Black Death is thought to have originated in the dry plains of Central Asia, where it traveled along the Silk Road, reaching Crimea by 1343. From there, it was most likely carried by Asian rat fleas living on the black rats that were regular passengers on merchant ships spreading throughout the Mediterranean and Europe. The Black Death is estimated to have killed 30 to 60% of Europe's total population. In total, the plague may have reduced the world population from an estimated 450 million down to 350 to 375 million in the 14th century. It actually took 200 years for the world population to recover to its previous level. The plague recurred as outbreaks in Europe all the way up until the 19th century, if you can believe that. The kids' game Ring Around the Rosie, Pocket Full of Posies, Ashes, Ashes, We All Fall Down, actually has its origin in the Black Death or the Black Plague. You can look that up or Google that. It's kind of interesting to think that a kid's rhyme or game still has its roots in this awful plague. When we're talking about the Black Death, we're talking about calamity, decay, and violence. In 1348, this bubonic plague epidemic began. We've talked about the population decline already. This was inspiration for Boccaccio's Decameron. He was an eyewitness to this plague, and in these various works that he was responsible for, which you see here, we see the human comedy versus the divine comedy. Continuing, we want to talk about the Great Schism. This was caused by Boniface VIII versus Philip the Fair of France. These rulers would always give themselves grandiose names. Richard the Lion-Hearted, Philip the Fair. Fair, of course, in that day and time meant beautiful or handsome. We also see at this time that the papacy or the Pope had to flee Rome and temporarily locate in Avignon. This was known in the Catholic Church as their time of Babylonian captivity. As a matter of fact, in 1378, there were as many as 3 different individuals claiming to be the Pope, and you can imagine what kind of confusion that caused among the Catholic Church. This led to a great deal of church reform. We'll also note the Peasant Revolt of 1381, and this was the basis of the Robin Hood myth. Sheriff of Nottingham, Robin Hood, Friar Tuck, all of these probably has its basis in this peasant revolt. So even though there's a lot of myth involved there, it was in some ways based on true events. The Hundred Years' War is another significant event. This was a conflict between France and England. Interesting that it was fought on French soil. And we want to note the Poitiers, the Crécy, and the Agincourt. Again, you'll be getting more detail on that as you read this material in your textbook. We're going through some of this a little more rapidly today. I should have made mention of that at the very beginning of the lecture. So we just wanted to outline some of these things to underscore some of the main important points. There was a pillaging band of mercenaries during this time, mercenaries being basically soldiers that can be hired to fight battles. And one of the big technological innovations during this time was, of course, the introduction of the longbow, which gave the archers a much greater range in their arrows. And you can imagine how this revolutionized warfare during this time. We now want to talk about the individual Petrarch. Petrarch was from Tuscany in the southern part of Florence. Petrarch was restless and curious, and he collected and copied ancient texts. In 1348, he was declared a poet laureate of Rome, the highest honor even today that a poet can receive. He partakes of a certain Renaissance sensibility, even though we're not talking about a full-blown Renaissance during this time of history. He predates some of that. And so we see Renaissance ideas that do come along later, such as the keen interest in self, a desire for personal glory and fame, and in this particular work, the secretum. Be familiar with that as you read up on that in your text as well. Continuing with Petrarch, we see his letter to posterity, very similar to Augustine's Confessions. You'll remember that Augustine's Confessions was the first autobiographical work in history, as far as we know. And so this is very much the same thing. Of course, the emphasis on Latin writings and being a Latin master was something that these individuals had mastered. But we also begin to see individuals engaging in what's called vernacular poetry. Vernacular meaning the common language of the day, so not Latin in this case. Examples of this are the canzonaires, the sonnets, the canzolis. These were said to have been inspired by Laura. Again, we have the idea perhaps of unrequited love here, but that's only a theory. And it leads to the concept of Petrarchism. And again, more good reading for you there in your text. Of course, many of you are already familiar with Geoffrey Chaucer, one of the most famous works of all time, the Canterbury Tales. We'll talk more about that later. Chaucer lived from the years 1340 to 1400. He was a highly placed civil servant, and he was a prolific writer, wrote poetries, did translations, did a treatise on the astrolabe being a very important invention for the seafarers, the sailors during that day, gave them a way to be able to maneuver on the high seas and in ways that they were not able to. This was another invention of the more of the Arabian cultures, specifically the Muslims, who preserved this a very, very important instrument. Chaucer also well known for using the English language. We're talking about the vernacular, the English language as a literary vehicle. He had great skill in the art of human observation. He was a great people watcher, and that comes into his works. They tend to be very real, even very bawdy, dealing with things that many writers had not dealt with up to this point. We mentioned the Canterbury Tales, a forerunner of a work. We see the narrative frame, the story arc. There's a cross-section of medieval society that's covered in the book. And we also note that there's a great deal of social commentary. We don't want to ignore the reality that there were female writers, specifically this one who was the first female professional writer, or at least one that's considered the first, Kristen de Pizan. In her literary debate, The Romance of the Rose, she attacked Jean de Meung's misogyny. In this letter to the God of Love and the Book of the City of Ladies, we see a great number of examples of her works. There's also the Treasure of the City of Ladies and the Book of Peace. So we see the women beginning to have a great impact on culture. We now want to move to the Italo-Byzantine background because we want to talk about art in Italy. Italy becomes a major player during this time, and then, of course, especially later on in the Renaissance. We want to note that Northern artists are inspired by classical art. By Northern artists, we mean the countries of France, England, and Germany, and they were very influential, and it gradually drifts down south to Italy. Now, the Italian artists are very rooted in the Byzantine style. And so we see this interesting contrast between classical art and the Byzantine style. The Byzantine style tends to be very conservative, very traditional, but these Italian sculptors broke from that tradition. So we have individuals like Pisano who had this emphasis on the classical model, and another Pisano, Giovannini, who partook very much of this northern influence. We see that in this work, The Death of the Virgin. We see the classical influences. We see this very doll-like figure of Mary. And again, it's easy to see the resemblance with the classical influences here. And again, by classical, we mean the Greek and Roman influences. Same thing here in Pisano's The Annunciation and Nativity. The crowds combine in both stories of the Annunciation and the Nativity. So we're going to see a real break from tradition from the Byzantine background. One of the big players when we talk about this particular Italo-Byzantine background, Cimabue. We don't know exactly when he was born, exactly when he died, but we have a general idea here. And so more and more this art is becoming more realistic. There's an understanding of anatomy because of advances in technology, and so we begin to see them here. And there's a great emotional appeal of this. There's a corporeal weight and strain to it, and a real sense of space. We begin to see some of the first three-dimensional depictions of people and objects. Not so much here as later in the Renaissance, but we see the early seeds of it. Duccio, again, not real sure of the birth and the death, but we have a general idea, also brings this emotional appeal, these emotional states of subjects through their physical appearances and through this greater sense of space. We can see it here with Cimabue, the realism here in these particular works. It's becoming more and more realistic, more and more three-dimensional, though again not nearly as much as we see later. The first one that we saw was of Jesus, obviously. The second one here is of Mary, the Madonna. So we begin to see this real break with Byzantine sculpture and painting. Giotto really contributes with this, a real break from the past. He's a revolutionary figure in a work by Vasari. Vasari was an individual who wrote very, very important books on these particular artists. He makes note of this revolutionary attitude of Giotto's. And of course, the realism is very evident. We have a depth, a volume through the use of lights and darks. We have a three-dimensional modeling of figures. This desire to imitate nature, this emphasis on the real world. So it's sometimes called the naturalistic style, and that's said to evoke a great deal of emotion and drama. We can see that here in Giotto's work. Everything, all the action is focused toward Jesus. This is said to depict when he was taken off the cross, and you see the great emotion in the faces of his mother and of the various disciples. And of course, one can't help but notice the angels hovering overhead. Again, that's designed to really get your attention. Continuing to talk about art in Italy, and specifically painting in Siena, again, we see this international style. We can see it in Martini's works. So versus Giotto's solid realism, within Martini, we see a certain grace, sophistication, a splendor, and elegance. There's an application of Giotto's realism, but the mood is different. However, the ones who really tend to imitate more of Giotto's style are people like Petro and Lorenzetti's works, and we see that in things like the Palazzo Pubblico fresco being a wall painting. And we'll note that later on. But let's look at Martini's work. Remember, he's Duccio's pupil. It's the last kind of signs or development of Gothic art, this international style. And so we're going to see a real break from this in the future. In Northern Europe, we also see changes. There is still the vestiges of the international style. They're reproducing much of this that is in Italy and in Northern Europe. We see this in works like the Wilton Diptych, also in the court of the Duke of Burgundy, Dijon. Klaus Sluter's Well of Moses is a good example of this, as well as the Limburg brothers. The Tres Riches, which is actually a calendar. Very, very interesting work. And again, we'll see this here in this diptych in the Death of the Virgin. A rich oak panel. Richard II and his patron saints. By the way, this particular individual became king at 11 years old. Richard II, that is. Interesting responsibility to put on an 11-year-old. We mentioned the Well of Moses earlier by Sluter. It was designed for a particular monastery. It's not really a well, it's called that. It's supported by a crucifixion, but it was meant to depict a well. We mentioned the Tres Riches de Duc de Berry by the Limburg brothers. It's an illustrated prayer book, also, as I mentioned earlier, an illustrated calendar. Picture calendars, we think about those as being something relatively new historically. They're not. Here's the calendar up here at the top, and here's the illustration at the bottom. The Limburg brothers tended to emphasize real, ordinary people, even though they would depict them in a very noble manner, as if they were rulers in many cases. So the idea of bringing out the nobility of the common man or the common woman. We'll now move to late Gothic architecture. The Florence Cathedral is the most famous of any of these works. It features Brunelleschi's dome. That's extremely important because it was the biggest dome in history built up to this point. So knowing how important domes are even to this day in our sporting architecture and arenas and things of this nature, this is where they began. We also recognize the importance of Duomo in Milan. He blended the Gothic and the classical elements. And we also note the secular public buildings. The Palazzo, by the way, Palazzo means palace. So the Palazzo Vecchio, the Palazzo Pubblico that we mentioned earlier, and also Doge's Palace in Venice. In England, they went after more of the perpendicular style. Again, another good thing to read up on. This is on my bucket list. This is the Florentine Cathedral that we mentioned in Florence. This is the entire cathedral group. It still stands to this day. We'll notice the monumental dome and the advances in architecture that Brunelleschi pioneered. These ribs were what made it possible for him to build such a huge dome. It's an incredible technological achievement. The bell tower, interestingly, was actually designed by Giotto. So this was a collaborative effort. Here we note the Milan Cathedral. It combined Gothic and classical styles. because it took such a long time to complete, it actually overlaps with the later Renaissance period. And again, it stands even to this day. This is the choir area of the Gloucester Cathedral in England. This was meant to bring out new musical stylings because obviously the choir would sing and perform in this particular structure and in this particular venue. We now want to touch on what's called the ars nova in music. Ars nova meaning the new nova, ars, arts, the new arts. Again, there are changes that are occurring here. And this is happening because of the newfound independence of many secular musicians. Remember that up to this time, a lot of the music has been exclusively for the church, or what we sometimes call sacred music. But we're beginning to see more and more the secular music take on greater importance. And these secular musicians would sing the ballads, the love songs, songs about current events. And so one of the big movers in the Ars Nova was Philippe de Vitry. And if you'll look in your Schoology topic folder on this section, we have some recordings of this available for you. De Vitry's music emphasized richness and complexity of sound, and also harmonies and isorhythm. Here we see a knight playing and singing to a lady. So we see these secular musicians, and notice the very idyllic surroundings, very peaceful, very calm. They're in a garden type environment. And it's meant to evoke that type of mood. Another of the famous musicians, Guillaume de Marchaux, he wrote music for the church primarily. The Missa de Notre Dame is one of his very well-known works, and there we see him writing music for the various parts of the Catholic Mass, the Mass being what Catholics call their worship service. And so we see the Kyrie eleison, the Gloria, the Credo, the Sanctus and Benedictus, and the Angus Dei. Again, if you'll look in the proper folder in Schoology, we have much material to describe this and give you much more of a background on the Catholic Mass, specifically these parts where the music are very involved. Again, we don't leave out the secular music. We see the ballads, the troubadour songs, and Marchaux wrote for both the church and outside the church. Another major individual was Landini. Interestingly, like Ray Charles and Stevie Wonder, he was a blind virtuoso performer, specifically on the organ, the lute, and the flute. And he wrote madrigals and ballads. And in his Musica Ficta, he actually documented notational problems that musicians were running into there. That brings us to the end of chapter 11. We'll see you next time for our next lecture.